And we're going to start with Anne Frye, who is an international specialist in the mobility needs of older and disabled people. Anne chaired the subgroup on disabled air travelers of the European Civil Aviation Conference from 1996 to 2011, and currently co-chairs the U.S. Transportation Research Board Subcommittee on International Activities in Accessible Transportation and Mobility. She also chairs the Transportation Committee of the Global Alliance on Accessible Technologies and Environments. I think we can pretty well say she's an expert. So with that, let me start with Anne.
Thank you. I'm going to use that. So yes. Thank you very much, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. What I want to talk about is some of the passenger experiences of air travel. Those of you who were in the last air travel session, we've seen some fabulously glossy pictures of what air travel is going to look like in the future. I want to reflect just a little bit about what it's like currently for people with disabilities, but then also to talk about the importance of trying to achieve compatibility in what is absolutely clearly a global market. I think if we start with what do travellers with disabilities want, it's self-evident, but clearly they want dignity, they want to be given the support they need by people who are properly trained to deliver it. They want assistance that is throughout all parts of the journey whenever they want it. And most importantly, they want to be sure that their wheelchairs and other equipment arrive intact at the same destination, which sounds kind of easy, but believe me, an awful lot of airlines and airports manage not to do that. What happens in reality? I've just got 3 different quotes from people with disabilities. Stig Langgaard is a Danish wheelchair user involved with the European Disability Forum. And his comment there that even if he books months in advance, he's still not sure if he's going to get to his final destination, and that every air journey is still a challenge. And that's a very recent quote. Similarly, from the UN Special Rapporteur on Disability, who clearly has to fly a great deal, again a wheelchair user, who's had the experience of being manhandled up the steps of an aircraft with nobody there trained or competent to deal with his needs. And typical Australian bluntness from Simon Darcy, manhandled, embarrassed, humiliated. These are not rare events, these are everyday events for people with disabilities. I see on a regular basis the complaints that come through in Europe, and these are fairly typical of things that can and do go wrong. And as we've heard this morning, it's a growing problem in so many ways. We have an aging population, more and more older people are travelling and are travelling regularly. Lorna's just put ice all over my chair, that's really nice. More and more low-cost carriers are making flying more affordable, so more and more of us are flying regularly. And as I mentioned this morning, in Europe at least, passengers with reduced mobility are increasing twice as fast in numbers of journeys than passengers overall. So it is the fastest growing market sector. So what are the challenges? Inaccessible airports, inaccessible aircraft, both boarding and on board, discriminatory airline practices, and I'll go into more detail on some of these, a lack of training, and I run a not-for-profit training company in the aviation world, so this is a particular bugbear of mine, loss or damage to mobility equipment we've talked about, and lack of connections with other transport modes. Again, I think that was mentioned by somebody this morning, that it is very rare for airports actually to tell you how you get there by an accessible means and how you get away from there. So it's very much a lack of joined-up thinking, if you like. So let's start by looking at the airports. I showed a ramp picture this morning for those who were there. This is another of my favorites. A lot of money and effort has gone into that ramp. And unless you're training Paralympic ski jumpers, I don't quite know what it's for. It is from Latvia, so beware if you're ever flying there. One of the biggest issues in airports is long distances, and not just off ramps. I don't know about you, but I get really annoyed by airports with signs up that say it's 10 minutes walk to the gate. Now, is that my walking speed? My grandmother's walking speed? Somebody with walking difficulty? Why don't they just tell you how far it is, and then you can make your own judgment whether you can do it or not do it in the time allowed. Poor signage. I would personally ban everybody who works in any kind of transport industry from putting up signs, because they know what they're doing and where they're going. You need to bring in a total stranger and say, what's the first thing you want to know when you get to an airport? So what's the priority of signs that you'd like to see? Absence of visual and audible information. More and more airports now don't make audible announcements because they say it causes stress to passengers. Again, I don't know about you, but I have much greater stress from not hearing, so I can't go and relax and read a book because I have to keep going to look at a screen that has tiny print up at the ceiling. Steps and stairs. Again, we're still building airports today that incorporate so many changes of level that you're going up and along and down. Why is that still necessary? Lack of assistance or poorly trained staff. Again, a huge complaint certainly in Europe. People have booked assistance, but it doesn't turn up for all sorts of reasons. They've overbooked, they haven't got the message through, whatever the reason, your journey is already in jeopardy because the assistance isn't there. Indignity of security searches. I have horror stories that I won't trouble you with of totally inappropriate security searches of passengers with disabilities from staff who have totally lack empathy, but also totally lack training. Even things as basic as making sure if you've searched the bag of a blind person, you've put everything back in the same order so they can find it. Things like that which are routinely ignored. Insensitive handling of prosthetic limbs or incontinence aids is quite a regular feature. I was delighted to know that in the US now, if you're over 70, you don't have to take your shoes off. I think that's fabulous, because so many older people say, well, I can take my shoes off, but I can't put them back on again without sitting down and taking a lot of time. So that sort of recognition, I just hope it doesn't lead to a lot of terrorists in their 70s and above with stuff in their shoes, but it's, you know, it's a good thing to do. And some of the new technologies, automatic check-in systems, are excluding older people who are not internet savvy and who haven't got themselves into that sort of technology. Moving on to the airlines, discriminatory policies. Again, I speak mainly from European experience. Denied boarding. We still have an issue with aircraft captains occasionally deciding that somebody can't travel alone. There was a very famous case of a wheelchair user who flew from Paris to Nice on her own, no problem, came to fly back, same airline, same route, 2 days later, and the captain wouldn't let her on board because she didn't have anyone traveling with her. That one is still going through the courts. Requiring an accompanying person when somebody has declared that they don't need one, again, that still happens. Failure to give people a safety briefing. Somebody who's blind or deaf, there are, again, very strict rules about individual safety briefings, but they don't always happen by any means. Remote stand boarding and deboarding. Again, low-cost carriers almost inevitably are out on the far side of the tarmac. We have many experiences where they don't like using high-loaders, ambulifts, because it delays the turnaround time, so they will do everything they can to get you on board in a less dignified but quicker way. And the rapid turnaround, I think, is one of the big issues here. And of course, that's, you know, that's at the heart of the economics of low-cost carriers, but there needs to be a way of dealing with it. Inaccessible washrooms. We've just in the last session seen some fabulous design concepts of more accessible on-board washrooms, but the majority of aircraft currently, it is still a struggle to manage, if you can manage at all. And again, we've touched on the loss and damage to mobility equipment. So what can we do? Let's just look quickly at a few things that I think would be useful. I think the thing that to me is the biggest problem is that although aviation is a global business, and we have legislation in Europe, there is legislation in the US and here in Canada, they're not compatible with each other. They all have the same intentions, but in some cases they're actually contradictory. We also have standards. We have ICAO, we have ICAC in Europe producing standards, but they're not enforceable. We heard in the last session that although technically the standards from ICAO are mandatory, they're not enforced, they're not enforceable, and generally speaking, they don't happen. So we have a real issue there. And of course, in very large parts of the world, there are no standards, there are no laws, so people are just left to chance. It seems to me that maybe the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities can play a part here. Certainly in many countries where there is no domestic law, both in aviation and other fields, it is being used as a catalyst to try and push accessibility. So if you're from a country that has nothing currently, if only to say you must introduce and apply Annex 9 of ICAO, this would be one way to start. And it is very clearly within the scope of the UN Convention. So, what are the basic principles? What I think we need, wherever you are in the world, wherever you're flying to and from, you need consistent monitoring and enforcement of the standards, whether it's by the civil aviation or some equivalent body. If they don't monitor and enforce, standards will slip. It doesn't matter if you've got laws, they won't be kept up to scratch. You need clear information for travellers on what to expect and how to ask for assistance. As I mentioned this morning, many of us are infrequent flyers, so we don't know what we need to know, so we don't know what to ask, and so the problems begin. There also need to be an easy way of complaining when things go wrong. One of my favourite European examples is an airline who said they didn't put out the leaflets they had on how to complain because people would take them away. So best not to put them out. And of course you need an effective means of redress against breaches of law or good practice. Now, in the US there are very strong penalties and they are rigorously enforced. In Europe, 28 member states, each doing their own thing, it's much more left to chance. But unless you have that consistency, you're not going to get consistency of service and delivery. And most important, rigorous and consistent training for all customer-facing staff. I know, again, speaking in European terms, some what we call PRM assistance providers in European airports have 3 to 5 days intensive classroom and practical training. Others are given a 20-minute video to watch and then sent off to start accompanying disabled passengers. So huge difference, and inevitably huge difference in the quality that you get. It's also, I mentioned that there is a lack of compatibility between European, US and other standards, so we need to avoid misunderstandings. So just to give one example, under US law, a wheelchair user can bring a manual wheelchair into the cabin. In European law, you can't. It has to go in the hold. This is not the time to argue what's right and what's wrong, but the fact is that if you don't know, and you've flown from the US and you want to transfer to a European flight, you're going to be very distressed to find that that wheelchair isn't going to go in the cabin with you. Similarly, and we've had a case just recently, under US law, you can train a service dog yourself, and you're allowed to carry it, to take it with you. It can be self-certified. In European law, it has to be a dog. It has to be a dog. We don't have any monkeys or anything else yet. I think the Americans are on our case on that one. But European law only accepts dogs that have been trained by a recognized international organization. So again, a lady flying recently into France with an emotional support dog, which she had trained herself and had no evidence that it had been trained under one of the recognized bodies, was refused onward travel within Europe. Now, had she known that was the case before she left the States, that distress and upset would have been avoided. Again, not the time to argue what's right and wrong, but it's just knowing what to expect. In Europe, you can request assistance from anywhere within the confines of the airport. If it's the long-term car park, the bus station, the train station, doesn't matter where, a hotel if it's on the site, all of those places have call points from which you can ask for assistance. In other parts of the world, that isn't the case, so people don't know where to start. Clear information, therefore, is hugely important, and we've talked about that. If you don't have clear information, you're not going to have a safe and comfortable journey. The sort of training that I think is needed is goes right through all staff. It's those who are in the shops and cafes. I'm sure we've all seen people in cafes at airports trying to hand a cup of hot coffee to somebody in a wheelchair who needs both hands to maneuver. All sorts of things. The people who clean the toilets, they don't need 5 days classroom-based training, but they do need to know that you don't leave your mops and buckets in there, because then people can't use it. So the training needs to be right across the board for everybody involved. So just to sum up, a huge increase worldwide in the numbers of people. So many of our international journeys begin and end with air travel. And even in those countries that do have legislation, there are often problems on a day-to-day basis. So we know how to build good facilities and to deliver good services, but we're not doing it yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Anne?
Thank you. It's kind of a question and sharing information, actually. I'm wearing a double hat here as United Nations, so I do travel a lot, and as a person who travels. So now I would like to talk as a person who travels, not as a UN representative here. And I am European, though I work in New York City. So, for instance, if you look at the IATA rules, the international travel and don't remember. Yes, thank you. There are no restrictions whatsoever. If you fly, at least this is my personal experience within the United States of America, there are no, and I talk about people who cannot walk. In my case, no, I can't walk, and do want to travel alone. Okay, so I'm bringing to the table another case. If I want to travel alone, it's okay within the United States of America, and it is fine if I take American Airlines and I want to fly abroad, unless it is an American airline, but the carrier, for instance, is, and now I go back to Europe, a European airline. Because European airlines, for whatever reasons, we won't go there into detail, most of them say that if you want to travel alone and the flight is longer than 3 hours, then you have to travel accompanied. While, this is my personal experience, but if I can be, how can I say, if I can get more information and update mine, I'll be more than happy. This is what I have been facing so far. So there are, based on my personal experience, 2 European airlines that do not have this kind of discrimination. One is British Airways, and the other one is a Swiss Air. Again, personal experience. So whenever I have to travel to Europe, unless I have a direct flight with an American airline, and there is no European carrier, it's USA Airlines or whatever, I have no problems flying to Europe or other parts of the world. Otherwise, I have to fly, in my specific case, British Airways, go to London. And then from London, I can take other flights to fly to other areas in the world. In a few weeks, for instance, I'll have to fly to India. I'm flying to London, British Airways, and from there, I keep flying to India. Because this is one of the few airlines, not only that has no discrimination and restrictions, on the contrary, the staff on the plane is very well trained to enable the passenger to use, for instance, facilities. Very well trained. So my personal choice is based not only on I can fly with that airline because I'm not obliged to have somebody to fly with me if the flight is longer than a certain amount of hours, but I do find personnel on the plane trained to help me to reach the restroom would I need to. Thank you.
May I just answer that in terms of European law? It is very clear in the law that the only reason that an airline can require you to have somebody with you is on safety grounds, and it is that you cannot get to the emergency exit in an emergency. It doesn't have to be by walking, it can be crawling, shuffling, whatever you do. You have to be able to reach and deploy the oxygen mask and fasten your seatbelt. And understand the safety briefing. Those are the only safety criteria. The fact that you couldn't get to the toilet unaccompanied is regarded not as a safety issue, it's a comfort issue. If you say you can go 5 hours without getting to the toilet, or you don't need assistance in the toilet, that is entirely your decision. And there have been some recent court cases, so if they're refusing you on the grounds that it's a long flight and you would need the toilet, that's not a safety issue, it's a comfort issue, it's outside the law. So we're quite clear on that. Having said that, and it's the same, I think, the world over, if there are onboard wheelchairs, they will help you get to the toilet, but they clearly won't assist you in the toilet because this is cabin crew who are also handling food and so on. But they should, in fact, they're required in European law to assist you in getting to and from the toilet. So I'm sorry to hear your experience, so I'm delighted that British Airways are doing so well. I'll tell them you're happy with them. But if you're having that experience with other European airlines, let me know or let the European Commission know, because that's a clear breach of the law. Thank you.
Well, we have an on-time arrival, so please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.